Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 4 of the Garot podcast. I am your host, Chingachgook, and I am once again in the studio with my co-host, Mr. Howard Roark. I'm rather pleased with the results of the previous episode. I hope that this episode will likewise exhibit similar productivity. That being said, if this is your first time joining us on the podcast, I'd just like to say, welcome. We are ecstatic to have you with us. You are, of course, more than welcome to keep tuning in, but please do note that these episodes are designed to build upon each other. What that means is, if you are having difficulty following our terms, it is most likely because we have already defined those terms in some previous episode. We highly recommend you go back to the beginning of the season and listen to the episodes sequentially in order to avoid those difficulties, if you haven't done so already. Correct. Today is going to be a very natural progression from the previous episode. Today's term that I'd like to unpack is the term that we call barbing. Now, I'll go into the etymology of how this term arose because this is actually one of my own terms that I initiated into the parlance that exists between the two of us. And then from that will be a couple of other terms that naturally grew out of the introduction of the term barbing. So, growing up, one of my favorite computer games to play was the Diablo 2 series, both the original and the expansion pack. For those of you sitting at home who have not had the opportunity to play any of the Diablo series, the key point about the Diablo series is that they belong to a category of video game called dungeon crawlers. Now, of course, Diablo 2 or any of the Diablo series, they were not the first in the genre of dungeon crawler video games. There were many other games who explored this genre, but the idea of the dungeon crawler video game is that you have your main character and then you go through a series of environments and you kill a variety of monsters or enemies or what have you. And it's through this process of exploring these environments that unpack and unfold into each other. That's how the game progresses. And that might sound like a general description of most video games. However, the dungeon crawlers were very much known and associated with a hack and slash style of gameplay. There wasn't really a lot of puzzle solving. There wasn't really a lot of other skill sets required in order to play games like Diablo 2. The gameplay was extremely straightforward. It was just point and click, and then as you hacked and slashed through the wide variety of monsters in the game, that's how you eventually leveled up. So that's the general description of the video game layout. Now, as a new player in that video game, you would have an immediate choice to make as soon as you start the game, because you can choose from a wide variety of different types of characters to play. So you have, in the original installment of the game, the sorceress, the necromancer, you have the paladin, the Amazon. And the significance of these different character classes that you can choose from at the very beginning of the game is such that each one of these characters has associated with them a certain style of gameplay. So for those of us who are familiar with video game parlance, you have terms like range attack, you have damage per second, the idea of the way these characters go through the game or the strategies that you have to employ for these different types of characters prioritize certain strategies over others. So either keeping your distance and dealing a lot of damage or getting up really close and being able to take a lot of damage. That's basically the idea behind these various character classes. Now, one of these characters in the Diablo 2 video game was a character called the Barbarian. So for those of you in the audience who have not had the opportunity to play Diablo 2 but have watched things like Conan the Barbarian, whether Arnold Schwarzenegger's original series or even the later movie iterations with Jason Momoa. The character of the barbarian in Diablo 2 was very much inspired from the Conan stories, the aesthetics and the use of how the character was designed and how the character is played is one of a tank, to use video game terminology. The barbarian takes a lot of damage and doesn't really have a lot of magical abilities, but specializes in being able to chop through large amounts of monsters in very, very rapid and very, very efficient succession. So there's this kind of lawnmower effect that you can get when you have multiple barbarians, for example, playing within a single arena, going through a particular dungeon or level together. This lawnmower effect is what I was reaching for and referencing when I suggested introducing the term barbing into our parlance. There's this idea of being able to have a similar lawnmower effect when it comes to churning through content, when it comes to using the logos, if you will. There's this idea of extreme amounts of almost vicious efficiency when it comes to using the logos. When you and I started having a lot of these logos-based conversations, barbing became a term that I naturally reached for to describe a type of conversation that we have. Because we don't barb all the time. The term barbing refers to a very, very specific style of communication and dialogue that is intimately tied with the meaning and the definition of logos. That's my general preamble.
I would like to reiterate a couple of points, even if it's by way of summary. There are several ways that video games can be broken, and it can be really fun to just figure out how to, for example, overcommit to a certain style or a certain mechanic within the gameplay. If you have multiple characters that are overcommitted, for example, to melee attacks, then you get what you're calling a lawnmower. It's more than what any individual character would be able to do on their own. And the amplified effect is because of the increase in quantity. That's what causes the overcommitment to any certain style to be effective at times, even if it's oversimplified. Barbing is definitely an appeal to efficiency, and it's definitely tied to the logos, insofar as both of us are always looking for the most efficient and most honest way to say something, to try and understand whatever the problem or whatever the material is that's in front of us. And we're both kind of racing to be able to understand the material as quickly as possible, which means that we have the use of shorthand whenever possible in order to push that efficiency even farther, because as soon as we can understand the material, then great, we can move on. Job well done. If that's the work that we need to be doing, because we need to understand something, then we might as well sit down and have a fully focused conversation. The logos is the best way to do that, and it always keeps both of us optimized for getting to the meta as efficiently and accurately as possible, because there's no sacrifice in quality.
I would also add in that the activity of barbing seems to only come into play when there's a question of meta involved.
Not necessarily, because if we already have the meta and we're trying to figure out whether it's tangible, then I would argue that that's a tangibility issue rather than a meta issue.
Sure, tangibility would be the particulars and the meta would be the substance that binds the particulars.
If something's intangible, deciding that something's intangible by trying to generate a possibility of how to bring the thumb down would be an example of something that isn't a question of what the meta is, it's a question of what the smaller steps of the material would be.
But nevertheless, that is a function of the logos, producing those examples of tangibility.
Well, right, because we're getting to the truth as close as we can manage.
What would you say is the best way to proceed in order to bring us closer to an articulated definition of the term barbing? Because I have a very key description when it comes to the idea of barbing.
Okay.
And that is When I try to explain barbing to other generic third-party individuals, particularly when I am finding myself in a situation where I can't really barb with anybody else, I find myself in this situation where I am constantly having to explain some manner of shortcoming. This gets me into difficulties oftentimes because my attempts to explain these difficulties result in ad hominem. The ad hominem of, oh, you just think that you're so much smarter than everyone else, and you think that I'm not smart enough to be able to engage in barbing.
I see. So you're trying to explain this to someone, and their response is defensiveness because you're criticizing them.
That is an example, certainly. Another example, I guess you could say, is, well, this is not something that these individuals would say themselves, but there is no teamwork. The idea of barbing is that there is an inherent level of teamwork that is occurring. It's not adversarial. You need to have two barbarians going through the dungeon crawl together, operating in tandem as a team. In that way,
Going in the same direction.
Going in the same direction. Now, this is something that confuses a lot of people because barbing has a lot of cosmetic similarities to adversarial confrontation.
Perhaps not from either of our perspectives, though.
That's exactly the reason why I say cosmetic similarities, because as soon as you actually look into the mechanics of what's going on, there's nothing adversarial actually happening.
Right, so you're describing a situation where someone is watching us barb through something, and they're coming to the conclusion that we're bickering.
Sure. Or, alternatively, another example that I have myself experienced is when I actually do try to engage in barbing with a third-party individual, they become adversarial because they assume that what's going on is an adversarial confrontation.
I've had that problem too. There's a certain kind of person historically that I've found to be reprehensible in any kind of a situation where I'm having dialogue with them. Because if I'm trying to speak with them to get some work done, and I'm pushing for things to be more efficient in that conversation, then that gets somehow identified as an attack on them, when all I'm asking for is that they try a little bit harder.
Well, not only that the level of efficiency is upgraded, but also the level of efficiency thereby brings the participants of the conversation closer to the verb masquerading as a noun known as the logos.
Right. The problem that I have is when someone opposes the efficiency directly, because it's not actually an assault on them, but they're identifying it as an assault, which makes things even less efficient. It would be better if we could just talk about the content. Whatever it is that we're discussing, we can talk about it for the sake of whatever it is that we're discussing. A lot of times people have problems with that because they're trying to read between the lines of something that I'm saying when I'm not actually saying anything more than the words that I'm using.
As an addendum, another problem that I've experienced in addition to this is that people are trying to win. There's this almost latent assumption that the process of engaging in the logos automatically presumes that there is a winner and a loser.
The best thing to do is to throw out the winner and loser so that both people can advance closer to understanding the world as it is. And the best thing to do is to throw away the unnecessary interpretations of these statements because there's no room to interpret them as attacks. Just do away with that. Look at the words as they are, respond to the words as they are, and then you can actually get somewhere.
So then let me propose this. One of the things that I have in my notes here is the phrase exploratory logical discourse. I'm a little unsure what to do with this because I'm not sure if this is a description or is this a definition of the term barbing. So if we were to posit this as a definition, then we could say perhaps barbing is a type of exploratory logical discourse, which would presume that there are more types of exploratory logical discourse, of which barbing would be a mere subcategory. Or another way that you could posit it is barbing is exploratory logical discourse, meaning that the term represents the entire process itself. Or we would have to posit that this is not a definition because it's missing something. It's merely a description. Yes, it has these elements. Barbing contains these characteristics, but it is not a sufficiently succinct definition that captures what's actually being referred to.
My inclination at the moment is that this is a description, particularly because there are problems that need to be accounted for that this description or start of a definition is not currently accounting for. It might be the case that those distinctions are somewhat redundant and that they can be combined. So let me give you an example. If you're going to look at something like exploratory logical discourse, and you're going to say, well, is it possible for exploratory logical discourse to get derailed? It seems somewhat obvious that the answer to that would be yes, even given the examples that we've already addressed. Barbing would be exploratory logical discourse that does not get derailed.
Well, not necessarily, because my immediate reaction to that is to think of the allegory of the Diablo 2 video game. Two barbarians doing a dungeon run in the Diablo 2 video game is very powerful and very efficient, but it's not necessarily invincible. It is possible for barbarians to still get taken down by some boss if they don't play their cards right, if they don't engage in sufficient strategy. If they just go without any forethought, then even from the perspective of gameplay, that doesn't usually end well for the players.
When you extend the invitation to someone else in these examples that you're laying out, and this person does not take that invitation, then the fact that these mutual attempts at understanding the information are no longer mutual destroys the term. It doesn't apply anymore. What do you say about the person who is offered barbing but rejects the offer? Are they rejecting discourse? Are they not willing to explore?
They are definitely rejecting exploration. And usually the thing that they're rejecting exploration for is winning. I win, you lose. I'm right, you're wrong. Are they rejecting discourse? A lot of times they do. For example, stereotypically, the individual who rejects discourse is rejecting discourse for bickering, for having an unproductive argument or fight. Is it logical? Maybe, perhaps in the most shallow of senses, they are utilizing some form of logic and rationality to defend their positions in the purpose of either winning or in the purpose of bickering. Oh, you are such an asshole because you did XYZ and blah, blah, blah. That happens, but it's not exploratory, and it's not discourse, certainly. Perhaps I can also put this descriptor on it as well. When I have been in situations in the past where I have tried to explain the definition of the term barbing, I find myself reaching for analogies of wrestling or analogies of jiu-jitsu or analogies of some form of grappling style of martial art, where you have two people rolling with each other on the mat and engaging in a form of competition. But the idea when you are engaged in a wrestling sparring match or a jiu-jitsu sparring match or a judo sparring match is not to have a winner or a loser, to say nothing of actually hurting or doing harm to the other individual. There are these parameters that define the scope of acceptable play, even though it might be cosmetically similar to some kind of adversarial process. The thing that comes to my mind is when Dr. Jordan Peterson talks about how he wrestled with his children growing up inside of the couch fort, where he would take the couches in the house and he would put them into a ring. So there's this big, soft, fluffy ring in the middle of the living room where nobody can get hurt. and he would put his kids into the ring and he would horse around and wrestle play with his children. And through that, he was able to use an unarticulated form of communication to bestow an unarticulated form of knowledge regarding the notion of an acceptable scope. And once that scope is understood, then what emerges from that is a process, a methodology. And in this context, the process and the methodology that arises is a style of exploratory logical discourse that brings both parties closer to the logos. These are all nice descriptions, but what I want to walk away with is a succinct definition.
I agree that the general rules for sparring apply insofar as you don't want to just overpower and destroy everyone that you spar with, because that's not sparring anymore. It's not a tournament when you're sparring. If you don't let someone else learn from the process, then you're not going to have anyone to spar with. So I know that you just referred to Dr. Peterson here, particularly in the context of the couches, and I would agree as well that the couches are a way to establish, as he said, if I remember rightly, this is what you can do and what you can't do. In the case of the child, they're learning for themselves, their own capacities, and how to use this body thing that a kid doesn't really know what it is yet. And they're also learning when they're interacting with someone who could absolutely dominate them physically, that if you want to do this again, you don't poke them in the eye. And as it turns out, children are willing to work to be able to go back into the couch ring. They really like that. They really want to do that again. So it's also in their best interests not to destroy the ability to go back to the couch ring again. They're trying to learn the rules so that they can continue to play. A common citation to back that up as well that I've heard from Dr. Peterson is the big rat, little rat situation, where, as it turns out, rats really like to play, and if you put the big rat in the cage with the little rat, the big rat has to let the little rat win the wrestling match a certain amount of the time, or the little rat won't ask the big rat to play ever again, and then no one has a sparring partner. So I'm just going to briefly gloss over that because, well, frankly, Dr. Peterson does a better job explaining it. I want to digress a little bit because I want to revisit the task at hand, where you're saying that you want to have a succinct definition of barbing, and I think that there are a couple of characteristics that we can identify as we're constructing this definition. I want to look at a couple of possibilities for what this description might require, and then see if we can put them together, see what problems there are. Barbing, as you were saying, is a form of discourse. It's a kind of dialogue. It's a technique. It's a way to talk about something that applies to the situation of mutually trying to get closer to the logos. So if I was going to build upon this idea of the logos, where the logos requires speaking, requires words. When you're talking about the logos requiring words, that's the logos as it applies to the individual that's speaking. But what if you have two? What if you have two individuals and now you have the logos in dialogue? Well, that creates a positive feedback loop.
Mm.
So something to the effect of barbing requires the logos and dialogue so as to optimize the use of the logos itself for both parties.
So then perhaps can we say that barbing is a situation in which two or more people are actively using the logos
together? Because they're not just talking in different directions or talking past each other.
Right. So for the sake of comedic effect, you have one person, you put them in room A, and they're sitting at a typewriter, punching the keys furiously away. You can say that that individual is actively using the logos. The words are going onto the page.
Okay.
And then you have another person in room B with another typewriter typing furiously onto the page. The second person is also actively using the logos as well, but these two individuals being in two completely separate rooms at their own typewriters doing their own things, this is not an example of barbing because they're not engaged in the process together.
In terms of a syllogism, I still reiterate that logos requires words, dialogue requires words.
Mm-hmm.
But logos does not require more than one person. Logos requires an individual. So what it looks like we're pointing at is the power of the logos, not just for the individual, but also for the individual in the context of that individual using the logos with other individuals in dialogue together. And then, of course, things are going to be more efficient as a result of that. The logos is always generated at the individual level.
Mm-hmm.
And the logos at that point is just the best option that you can manage. That can be applied to every individual, therefore more than one individual can participate in the process that is the logos at the same time. They can do it separately, like the typewriters in different rooms, but they can do it at the same time if they're in the same room having a discussion, assuming that that's their intention, trying to figure out the next best response.
Barbing is defined as a situation in which two or more individuals are actively using the logos together.
You might have to just say two.
Well, I mean, presumably you can have three people in a room.
That's going to look more like one individual to another individual, and you just have three channels.
I see. So you have person A talks to person B, person A talks to person C, person B talks to person C. And then they just switch between each other.
Mm-hmm.
And then at any given moment when person A is talking to person B, then in that moment, person C is merely an observer.
Correct.
Got it. So then barbing is a situation in which two people are actively using the logos together.
In dialogue. So the logos requires words.
Mm-hmm.
Barbing requires communication. It requires an exchange. I'm calling that dialogue.
Mm.
Well, the most efficient way, arguably, to do that is speaking.
Right. I like that.
Really hard to have efficient dialogue trying to type anything.
Let alone writing by hand. Is there anything you want to add on before I throw a monkey wrench into this?
Could you repeat back to me the definition as it stands?
Yeah. So the definition as it stands is barbing is a situation in which two people are actively using the logos together in dialogue.
All right. Logos requires words. Barbing requires dialogue. Dialogue requires words. So you have two people. I like that as well because it keeps the logos individualized. And that's the most important part. You don't get logos that you get to apply to
everyone but no one in particular.
Correct. Everyone but no one in particular.
Right.
I just wanted to recognize, as a part of this definition, that we have a situation in which two people are actively using the logos together in dialogue, and the efficiency is a consequence of that situation.
I think that's worth elaborating on. The efficiency is a consequence of that situation.
One of the reasons that we opened up with this term in terms of its utility is that it has what you refer to as a vicious efficiency.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think that we can refer to barbing without addressing efficiency in some manner. So if you want to say that efficiency is the natural and inevitable consequence of this situation in which two people are actively using the logos together in dialogue, then
they will naturally get better over time. And then as their skill of using the logos increases over time, then that's when the efficiency gets put into a positive feedback loop.
Correct. Logos in dialogue makes things more efficient. And logos gets you to the best option. A lot of our barbing conversations, a lot of the times we're just trying to figure out the best way to proceed.
Correct.
So in using the logos in dialogue, we're able to efficiently generate the best way to proceed in any given circumstance.
Correct. Which derives from the definition of the logos itself. That's a really nice segue into a very murky idea to talk about, despite the fact that you and I use it so often in our parlance. To kind of riff off of what you were talking about pertaining to trying to find the best option, trying to find the best way to proceed, inherent to this barbing process is a need to specify, a need to delineate something as being fundamentally distinct from something else. A is over here and B is over here.
Mm-hmm. These things need to be separated.
These things, whatever they are, need to be separated.
Correct.
The term that we use to describe this need of being able to specify anything as being separate from something else is the Pirsig knife. For our readers at home, the idea of the Pirsig knife comes from a book entitled Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, written by Robert Pirsig. This novel, this philosophical treatise, masquerading as a novel, is arguably one of my favorite books of all time. I can go into an entire diatribe about all the things that I love about this book, but my praise of this particular piece of writing need not concern us here for this episode. However, what is so interesting about this idea of the Pirsig knife is that inherent in the idea of the Pirsig knife, there are options. There are different ways to delineate the same thing. So now that we have a encapsulated definition of barbing, the next thing that jumps out of us when we're trying to adequately articulate this process of barbing is we now have to acknowledge what you and I call the Pirsig knife and now establish a definition for the Pirsig knife. Luckily, I have a rather straightforward way to laterally drift around this. The idea of the Pirsig knife comes from a specific passage in Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance that I can read for us right now to give the audience at home a context of the passage from which we derived this term. And then we can play with it and riff on it as we go on. I highly, highly recommend the audience at home find the time and gives themselves the opportunity to go through this book. It is a hefty read, but extremely worthwhile. The passage that I'm about to read is toward the beginning portion of the novel, and the idea of this particular scene in the novel is that the narrator of the story is on a motorcycle road trip with his son, who's riding on the back of his motorcycle, and then on the other motorcycle are his friends John and Sylvia. Now, John and Sylvia are married. The nature of the book is that the narrator phases in and out between describing what's going on the road trip and his conversations with John and conversation with Sylvia, and a narration or an exposition upon the ideas, the meta ideas that arise from his conversations with John and Sylvia and his attempts to try to get under what are the meta principles, what are the axioms that are either affirmed or denied differently between the narrator, John and Sylvia. It's a very, very interesting read, particularly with regards to how the narrator handles those kinds of phase shifts.
Thumb up, thumb down, thumb up, thumb down.
Correct. Yeah. So thumb up, thumb down. Absolutely right. The passage that I'm about to read is in the process of transitioning from thumb down, describing what's going on the road during the journey as they're making their way on the road trip with John and Sylvia, to the thumb up considerations of the questions at stake of what's going on. For those who are lucky enough to already have a copy on hand who are interested, this is Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, the Harper Torch edition, copyright originally 1974, but also once again renewed in 1999. A little bit in from chapter 6, page 88 in my edition. His way of looking at things produces a kind of description that can be called an analytic description. That is another name of the classic platform from which one discusses things in terms of their underlying form. He was a totally classic person. And to give a fuller description of what this is, I want now to turn his analytic approach back upon itself, to analyze analysis itself. I want to do this, first of all, by giving an extensive example of it, and then by dissecting what it is. The motorcycle is a perfect subject for it, since the motorcycle itself was invented by classic minds. So listen. A motorcycle may be divided for purposes of classical rational analysis by means of its component assemblies and by means of its functions. If divided by means of its component assemblies, its most basic division is into a power assembly and a running assembly. The power assembly may be divided into the engine and the power delivery system. The engine will be taken up first. The engine consists of a housing containing a powertrain, a fuel-air system, an ignition system, a feedback system, and a lubrication system. The powertrain consists of cylinders, pistons, connecting rods, a crankshaft, and a flywheel. The fuel-air system components, which are part of the engine, consist of a gas tank and a filter, an air cleaner, a carburetor, valves, and exhaust pipes. The ignition system consists of an alternator, a rectifier, a battery, a high voltage coil, and spark plugs. The feedback system consists of a cam chain, a camshaft, tappets, and a distributor. The lubrication system consists of an oil pump and channels throughout the housing for distribution of the oil. The power delivery system accompanying the engine consists of a clutch, a transmission, and a chain. The supporting assembly accompanying the power assembly consists of a frame, including foot pegs, seat, and fenders, a steering assembly, front and rear shock absorbers, wheels, control levers and cables, lights and horn, and speed and mileage indicators. That's a motorcycle divided according to its components. To know what the components are for, a division according to functions is necessary. A motorcycle may be divided into normal running functions and special operator-controlled functions. Normal running functions may be divided into functions during the intake cycle, functions during the compression cycle, functions during the power cycle, and functions during the exhaust cycle, and so on. I could go on about which functions occur in their proper sequence during each of the 4 cycles, then go on to the operator-controlled functions, and that would be a very summary description of the underlying form of a motorcycle. It would be extremely short and rudimentary as descriptions of this sort go. Almost any one of the components mentioned can be expanded on indefinitely. I've read an entire engineering volume on contact points alone, which are just a small but vital part of the distributor. There are other types of engines than the single-cylinder auto engine described here: 2-cycle engines, multiple-cylinder engines, diesel engines, Wankel engines, but this example is enough. This description would cover the what of the motorcycle in terms of components, and the how of the engine in terms of functions. It would badly need a where analysis in the form of an illustration, and also a why analysis in the form of engineering principles that led to this particular conformation of parts. But the purpose here isn't exhaustively to analyze the motorcycle. It's to provide a starting point, an example of a mode of understanding of things which will itself become an object of analysis. There's certainly nothing strange about this description at first hearing. It sounds like something from a beginning textbook on the subject, or perhaps a first lesson in a vocational course. What is unusual about it is seen when it ceases to be a mode of discourse and becomes an object of discourse. Then certain things can be pointed to. The first thing to be observed about this description is so obvious, you have to hold it down or it will drown out every other observation. That is, it is just duller than ditch water. Yada, 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 yada. Carburetor, gear ratio, compression. Yada. Piston plugs, intake, yada, and on, and on, and on. That is the romantic face of the classic mode. Dull, awkward, and ugly. Few romantics get beyond that point. But if you can hold down that most obvious observation, some other things can be noticed that do not at all first appear. The first is that the motorcycle, so described, is almost impossible to understand unless you already know how one works. The immediate surface impressions that are essential for primary understanding are gone. Only the underlying form is left. The second is that the observer is missing. The description doesn't say that to see the piston, you must remove the cylinder head. You, quote unquote, aren't anywhere in the picture. Even the operator is a kind of personalityless robot whose performance of a function on the machine is completely mechanical. There are no real subjects in this description. Only objects exist that are independent of any observer. The third is that the words good and bad and all their synonyms are completely absent. No value judgments have been expressed anywhere, only facts. The fourth is that there is a knife moving here, a very deadly one. An intellectual scalpel so swift and so sharp, you sometimes don't see it moving. You get the illusion that all those parts are just there and are being named as they exist. But they can be named quite differently and organized quite differently, depending on how the knife moves. For example, the feedback mechanism, which includes the camshaft and cam chain and tappets and distributor, exists only because of an unusual cut of this analytic knife. If you were to go to a motorcycle parts department and ask them for a feedback assembly, they wouldn't know what the hell you were talking about. They don't split it up that way. No two manufacturers ever split it up quite the same way, and every mechanic is familiar with the problem of the part you can't buy because you can't find it because the manufacturer considers it a part of something else. It is important to see this knife for what it is and not be fooled into thinking that motorcycles or anything else are the way they are just because the knife happened to cut it up that way. It is important to concentrate on the knife itself. Later, I will want to show how an ability to use this knife creatively and effectively can result in solutions to the classic and romantic split. Phaedrus was a master with this knife and used it with dexterity and a sense of power. With a single stroke of analytic thought, he split the whole world into parts of his own choosing. Split the parts and split the fragments of the parts, finer and finer and finer, until he had reduced it to what he wanted it to be. Even the special use of the terms classic and romantic are examples of his knifesmanship.
I do hope that people made it far enough into that reading that they didn't just turn it off during the dull mechanical description before you got to the part where he acknowledges that this is the first big problem.
So this is the passage from which our use of the term the Pirsig knife arose. So now that we have this passage out on the table, the task before us at hand is to provide a succinct definition of the term Pirsig knife. It seems to me that an understanding of the Pirsig knife and a skillful use of the Pirsig knife is an inherent part of what happens when barbing occurs.
Okay.
I've wanted to say to people, you're using the Pirsig knife incorrectly. Or the Pirsig knife doesn't go there. And of course, I can't come out and say these things because I don't have a definition of Pirsig knife right on hand. Or you need to bring the Pirsig knife down here. Even though that's a term that makes complete sense in the context of our dialogue, the generic third-party individual looks at me and says, what are you saying?
As we continue the process of constructing these definitions, I do want to point to something that does come out of a description in terms of the phrasing that's somewhat common to the use of the term Pirsig knife is that we talk about the Pirsig knife coming down on something, which is the act of dividing. Part of what this passage and what the reference to the Pirsig knife is supposed to acknowledge is the fact that there are many different ways that things can be divided, even if everyone's looking at the same thing. Part of what the Pirsig knife is pushing back against is the situation where someone doesn't think that the division can be changed to anywhere else, when it can, assuming that you're high enough in the meta, because once you make the division, you have to follow through with dividing it into a finer part.
One thing that I can predict the generic individual reacting to that statement you just made would be to say something along the lines of, so that means divisions where you place the Pirsig knife are arbitrary.
No, it's not arbitrary, it's selected, it's decisive, and it's possible to choose how things are divided because it enables a description that otherwise wouldn't be possible.
Sure, but what the generic individual will retort to that is an appeal to relativism. That means that your way of bringing down the Pirsig knife and my way of bringing down the Pirsig knife, there's no way to say which one is better.
There is a way to say which one is better. You're trying to get at the question that is, what do you tell someone when they try and say that all things can be divided in different ways infinitely, therefore it doesn't matter how anything's divided?
Correct.
It does matter, because the ability to divide something a different way, that's a way to generate an alternative. And then you can divide something in a different way with the intention of generating a superior alternative, which is by definition better than what it was before. So if you're creating the alternative with the intention of replacing what you currently have, you're not going to be able to deny the utility of better. You're going to actually need to look at whether it is or isn't better. Just because you intend for it to be better doesn't mean that it actually is, but that just means that you can continue the process of engaging with the logos to try and pull out the best possible alternative. And then if you're able to pull out a better alternative, then you've improved upon your situation. When you say that someone doesn't address what's better, that's not a problem with the knife. That's not a problem with the divisions. That's a problem with whether this individual is asking the question about what's better about anything at all. If you're not asking the question of what's better, then you're not engaged in the logos.
There's a closer way to say that. It is self-evident that the results of bringing the Pirsig knife down in different locations and different places and coming up with different results can be compared. And because they can be compared, that means that one will be better than the other. Like you were saying with the logos is concerned with what is the best possible option. There will always be something that rises to the top of the hierarchy when you compare the 2-on-2. Compare these two things. Now you compare these two together. It's a heat bracket.
I would go so far as to say that it's also inherent to the ability to compare things, to ask the question of what's better. And that it's possible to generate an alternative that is better. That it's possible, in the case of the Pirsig knife, to move the divisions to a different place, even if it's for the sake of analysis, even if it's for the sake of isolating a part of this mechanism, physical or conceptual, that needs to be looked at within the context of cross-examination. It's possible to move the division between two things and separate them, and it's therefore possible as a consequence that it can be the case that moving this division is better than what you had before. And just because it can be the case, that's all that you really need in order to engage in the process. Because it's the best option that you have in order to improve what's in front of you.
So just to provide a painfully obvious example taken directly from the text itself, when Pirsig says, if you were to go to a motorcycle parts department and ask them for a feedback assembly, they wouldn't know what the hell you were talking about. They don't split it up that way. No two manufacturers ever split it up quite the same way, and every mechanic is familiar with the problem of the part you can't buy because you can't find it because the manufacturer considers it a part of something else.
Right.
So using this as a very thumb-down example, it is possible to declare it is better to consider this part as a part of X as opposed to being a part of Y. And that there is an ability to make that comparison of the results are better when you move the classifications around in this manner. Either it becomes easier, it becomes more intuitive, it becomes smoother. You gain something. Something is gained when the categories are adjusted and switched around. And perhaps the definition of the Pirsig knife is intimately related with the idea of categories. Maybe that'll feature in the definition somehow, I'm not sure, but that's what we're trying to get to the bottom of.
At the moment, the Pirsig knife is the tool that's used to decisively make a distinction.
So it's a method. The Pirsig knife is a method. Can we say that?
I'm not sure what you mean by method.
Well, a method is a way of doing something.
I suppose we can call it a method, because insofar as the knife is a way to divide things, it would be a method of dividing things.
Would it be more precise to say that it is a method of subdividing things?
Might be better.
Because you're taking a thing and then you're splitting it into two or more parts, that when you reassemble the two or more parts, it becomes the initial thing that you were looking at.
But there are multiple ways to subdivide.
Correct. And that's the reason why inherent in the idea of the Pirsig knife is the idea of options. Like what Pirsig was saying himself in the passage, you can subdivide according to its parts, you can subdivide according to its function.
Mm-hmm. But the measure adds up.
But it always adds up to the original thing that you were looking at.
Method of subdividing. Let's keep it for now.
Now, is that a description or is that a definition?
It's a description. It's still missing a couple things. Particularly when this is brought to the environment of interacting with someone that doesn't know the term. For example, when either of us says that the knife is coming down in the wrong place, that's indicating that there's a different way to subdivide something that's either outright superior or going to illuminate some kind of problem or solution that so far hasn't been specified in order to make progress. A lot of times it's the consideration of, well, what if we divided these things in a different way?
What if we subdivided these things in a different way?
Correct. What if we subdivided these things in a different way? Do the pieces still add up, for example? Sometimes we're trying to look at the whole structure of the meta, and there might be a piece missing. So moving the knife to isolate what's missing can be extraordinarily helpful in figuring out the part that needs to go into the metastructure in order for it to be complete.
Well, that would be the gain that you receive by adjusting the location of where you bring the knife down. And that gain is what indicates the superior option.
The method of subdividing things, that might be sufficient then for a definition, because otherwise what you're trying to do is you're trying to acknowledge the utility of changing the subdivision in order to understand something even more. First of all, by granting that the subdivision can be changed at all. That's definitely part of the term and what needs to be acknowledged. Because it's not obvious, even looking at the passage, that the division can be moved, and that someone decided to make that subdivision, and that therefore you as the individual have the ability to also choose to make a subdivision in a different location, if you know how, if you can, which is why it's a skill.
So how about this for a definition? The Pirsig knife is a method of subdivision that provides more than one option of analysis.
I might add that it's a method of decisive subdivision. It's important to acknowledge that the individual is choosing where the subdivision occurs. It's more than just multiple options that it provides. It's a method of decisive subdivision that provides additional options for viable alternatives. You're not just trying to create divisions for the sake of it, you're actually trying to improve on the situation, which means that you need an alternative that's viable, and this is a means to generating a viable alternative, because you might be able to restructure things in such a way where it's better. So that's one part of it, but the other part of it is that sometimes you just need to rearrange something so that you realize that what you had before was actually right, because you just didn't understand the cross-examination of it.
The reason why I'm at the moment okay with resting upon more than one option of analysis is because what you're trying to account for with the idea of alternatives, with the idea of trying to find a better option.
That's already in the logos.
That's already in the logos.
All right.
So walk with me through this. The logos is the most reliable process by which words are used to provide the best possible option in any given circumstance. Barbing is a situation in which two people are actively using the logos together in dialogue. In this situation, this can happen both at the level of the individual, where it's just one individual with the logos, or two individuals using the logos together in dialogue. What oftentimes comes up in using the logos is a need to use the Pirsig knife, which is a method of decisive subdivision that provides more than one option of analysis. And then once you have those multiple options, it's the logos that tells you that's the better one.
Which is also subject to the positive feedback loop of the dialogue.
Correct.
Which is why it's always a part of the process of dialogue.
Correct.
What if we bring the knife down over here instead? What would that do to the system that we're analyzing? Would everything be ruined? Would it be better? Does the problem still exist if we isolate it?
Because it is possible that your usage of the Pirsig knife will generate worse options, worse conditions. But that's okay, because that's when the logo steps in and says, well, these are all worse. Choose this one over here. Choose the one you originally had. So in a sense, what I'm trying to reach for is this idea that the Pirsig knife operates in service to the logos, because the Pirsig knife provides the logos the smorgasbord, and then the logos says this one. It's the logos that's concerned with the question of best.
Is it redundant to say that it's a method of decisive subdivision that provides a means to more than one option of analysis?
It's redundant.
Okay.
I thought you were going to go the direction of providing more than one option of analysis to the logos, because it's the logos that does the selection process.
But I don't know if that's redundant either, because you might have a situation where using the Pirsig knife is always generating those subdivisions for the logos. You can generate subdivisions for something else, but at that point, it wouldn't be the logos anymore.
We can leave that out. That's a pretty good base already as it stands right there.
So
the Pirsig knife is a method of decisive subdivision that provides more than one option of analysis.
it might be obvious to say that it's in service of the logos because we're referring to the Pirsig knife in the context of barbing, which is already subject to the logos.
Right.
And there isn't really a use of the Pirsig knife outside of a context of the logos anyways. We can either put it in the definition or we can just say it's inherent to the term.
We can say that it's inherent to the term for the sake of conciseness. But I like that.
It is mostly a tool. And Pirsig refers to it as a blade, not the person. So it's something that a person uses skillfully in order to make cuts that make things more productive. Just because you have a blade doesn't mean that slashing it is going to create something more productive. Incredible damage can be done with a blade, probably more often than not. And it takes the skill of the person who's making this division and making this cut to make this cut in such a way where something that is getting separated ought to be separated. It's good to separate these things. And that's not obvious what it is. You're trying to improve things by using the Pirsig knife. You're trying to improve things by separating things with this blade, not destroy them. It's not really worth pushing the metaphor into destroying things in the physical world. Good news is if you're using the Pirsig knife and you're wrong, then back to where you were before. Try again, somewhere else.
So I really like that. That's a really nice definition. We have one more element to acknowledge in order for the context of barbing to be complete, particularly in the sense that you and I use it. It's another term that comes from this same book, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. And the term, the phrase that we use is being on the front of the train, being on the front of Pirsig's train, to describe a condition that you and I are all too familiar with. The condition of being on the front of Pirsig's train, to kind of drift around this a bit before I pull out the passage from which this is derived, being on the front of the train is a condition that provides understanding. If you want to expand understanding, if you want to expand knowledge, the location where that expansion occurs is the front of Pirsig's train. Now, again, like with all these other toolkit terms, I've been in situations where I've tried to explain this to third-party individuals and they look at me like I'm a crazy person, but they have no idea what I'm saying, and I have no definitions on hand. So barbing, it's very intimately connected with Pirsig knife and being on the front of Pirsig's train, and all these things together are very intimately connected with the idea of the logos.
Mhm.
What I like to do now, once again, is to do a passage reading where Pirsig talks about this analogy of a train and how that relates to this idea of how knowledge and understanding is expanded, and then derive a succinct definition of that term as it exists in our common parlance. And this is, just by way of introduction, yet another one of those passages in the novel where the narrator is giving a very much thumb up soliloquy on a set of ideas as he's phasing in and out of the thumb down descriptions of what's occurring in the story and the thumb up descriptions of the ideas that he's considering. For those who would like to read along, this is chapter 24 of Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. In my edition, the penultimate paragraph beginning on page 361. By returning our attention to quality, it is hoped that we can get technological work out of the non-caring subject-object dualism and back into craftsman-like, self-involved reality again, which will reveal to us the facts we need when we are stuck. In my mind now is an image of a huge, long railroad train. One of those 120 boxcar jobs that cross the prairies all the time with lumber and vegetables going east and with automobiles and other manufactured goods going west. I want to call this railroad train knowledge and subdivide it into two parts: classic knowledge and romantic knowledge. In terms of the analogy, classic knowledge, the knowledge taught by the Church of Reason, is the engine and all the boxcars, all of them and everything that's in them. If you subdivide the train into parts, you will find no romantic knowledge anywhere. And, unless you're careful, it's easy to make the presumption that's all the train there is. This isn't because romantic knowledge is non-existent or even unimportant. It's just that so far, the definition of the train is static and purposeless. This is what I was trying to get at back in South Dakota when I talked about two whole dimensions of existence. It's two whole ways of looking at the train. Romantic quality, in terms of this analogy, isn't any part of the train. It's the leading edge of the engine, a two-dimensional surface of no real significance unless you understand that the train isn't a static entity at all. A train really isn't a train if it can't go anywhere. In the process of examining the train and subdividing it into parts, we've inadvertently stopped it so that it isn't a train we are examining. That's why we get stuck. The real train of knowledge isn't a static entity that can be stopped and subdivided. It's always going somewhere, on a track called quality. And that engine and all those 120 boxcars are never going anywhere except where the track of quality takes them. And romantic quality, the leading edge of the engine, takes them along that track. Romantic reality is the cutting edge of experience. It's the leading edge of the train of knowledge that keeps the whole train on track. Traditional knowledge is only the collective memory of where that leading edge has been. At the leading edge, there are no subjects, no objects, only the track of quality ahead. And if you have no formal way of evaluating, no way of acknowledging this quality, then the entire train has no way of knowing where to go. You don't have pure reason, you have pure confusion. The leading edge is where absolutely all the action is. The leading edge contains all the infinite possibilities of the future. It contains all the history of the past. Where else could they be contained? The past cannot remember the past. The future can't generate the future. The cutting edge of this instant, right here and now, is always nothing less than the totality of everything there is. Value, the leading edge of reality, is no longer an irrelevant offshoot of structure. Value is the predecessor of structure. It's the pre-intellectual awareness that gives rise to it. Our structured reality is pre-selected on the basis of value. And really, to understand structured reality requires an understanding of the value source from which it's derived. One's rational understanding of a motorcycle is therefore modified from minute to minute as one works on it and sees that a new and different rational understanding has more quality. One doesn't cling to old sticky ideas because one has an immediate rational basis for rejecting them. Reality isn't static anymore. It's not a set of ideas you have to either fight or resign yourself to. It's made up, in part, of ideas that are expected to grow as you grow, and as we all grow, century after century. With quality as a central, undefined term, reality is, in its essential nature, not static, but dynamic. And when you really understand dynamic reality, you never get stuck. It has forms, but the forms are capable of change. To put it in more concrete terms, if you want to build a factory, or fix a motorcycle, or set a nation right without getting stuck, then classical, structured, dualistic subject-object knowledge, although necessary, isn't enough. You have to have some feeling for the quality of the work. You have to have a sense of what's good. That is what carries you forward. This sense isn't just something you're born with, although you are born with it. It's also something you can develop. It's not just intuition, not just unexplainable skill or talent. It's the direct result of contact with basic reality. Quality, which dualistic reason has in the past tended to conceal. What then does it mean to be at the front of Pirsig's train? What is the definition of Pirsig's train?
Let me ask you this. I need a thumb down example. So when would you use this term?
I would use this term in the context of a joke that you and I occasionally toss back and forth with each other.
Okay.
One of the ad hominems that I frequently encounter is, you're just a philosopher sitting under a tree.
Mm.
The reason why this is such a venomous dismissal is because the idea behind the image of a philosopher sitting under a tree is one of uselessness.
Mm-hmm. Lack of motion.
Lack of motion. Nothing is getting accomplished.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing is happening.
Mm-hmm.
Wastefulness.
Mm-hmm.
Here is this individual who might be so intelligent and smarter than everyone and has more understanding than everyone else, but they are disconnected from reality. The joke that you and I retort with to this type of ad hominem is, I'm not a philosopher sitting under a tree. I'm a philosopher strapped to the front of a train.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea, as this train is barreling down the track of quality, we're screaming our heads off, but yet there's something admirable about this image of this philosopher willingly strapping himself to the front of a freight train, screaming for the sake of trying to expand knowledge and understanding. That is very much a situation where I would pull out the reference of Pirsig's train, because the ad hominem of being a philosopher sitting under a tree is very real. Another form that this takes is ivory tower. I think the term ivory tower is fairly widely known in the West, particularly in American English. The term ivory tower is used to dismiss academics who have no practical understanding of a particular thing, whatever that thing may be. Like, oh, these professors, these academics stuck in their ivory tower. Philosopher sitting under a tree is just another form of that.
Again, referring to things that are static and
Somehow
useless,
somehow intangible even.
The ivory tower also has the implication of problematic pretension.
Another ad hominem that I have constantly run into is being off in the clouds. So explaining Pirsig's train has many uses, but one of the uses that comes to the top of my mind, if you were to ask for a thumb down example, is to repudiate the ad hominem of dismissal.
Basically to redirect that metaphor towards a more appropriate one, which would be the train. So you have a problem because when you're trying to tell someone who's trying to dismiss you using ad hominem that you're not under a tree, you're not in an ivory tower, you're not in the clouds, but you're strapped to the front of a train, that just doesn't land.
Correct. Because what's the definition of a train? What train?
It's interesting, before you read this passage that we were talking about, decisive subdivision, and then that passage opens up with, I want to call this railroad train knowledge, and I want to subdivide it into two parts, this and this, classic and romantic knowledge.
So that's the Pirsig knife coming down at this location.
But it's built into the sentence, I want to divide it this way. These situations are defensive, but you're basically describing a situation where, first of all, by comparison to the tree, the tower, or the clouds, being on the front of a train is not safe, and it's not peaceful. So it's a dangerous and
taxing,
I was going to say strenuous, taxing is good, condition that happens as a result of interacting with the logos in order to generate new and better material. It's not also, by comparison to the tree, tower, or cloud, static. It's in motion. Because, as Pirsig was describing, the train's not a train if it's not moving. The train's not a train if it has nowhere to go. Part of the definition of the train is that it can move from one place to another place.
But that it does.
And that it does. Right.
Part of its definition is the actualization of its function.
Right. Which has consequences. So it's not static. There are things that the train is not, that the tree, tower, or clouds would be. And I don't know if this is the right place to bring the knife down, but it might give us somewhere to start and we can move it to somewhere else. So the tree or the tower or the cloud it's not safe. It's not comfortable. It's not static. So you could put opposites for those into the definition if you wanted. I'm not sure if that's what you're getting at, though. Is there a broader definition rather than your own defense that you're looking to cover?
You asked for a random thumb down example. The objective here is to be able to explain to the generic third-party observer what Pirsig's train is. Because once you understand what Pirsig's train is, you can then understand what it means to be on the front of Pirsig's train. When you are in the midst of having difficulty articulating something, and you're tripping over your words, and you are not providing clear, coherent definitions, you are not making tangible statements, and the generic individual looks at you and says, what's your problem? What are you saying? And you say, I'm having a hard time. I'm on the front of Pirsig's train. And the generic third party looks at you and goes, huh? The reason why the succinct definition of Pirsig's train, or being on the front of Pirsig's train, is so necessary is that it is a vital tool to explain to an observer the difficulty under which you struggle in any given moment or instance. Just speak, just say the bottom line, plain English. These are examples of pathological proclamations to somebody who is at the front of Pirsig's train but doesn't have the ability to explain what their condition is. Because Pirsig's train is invisible. It's not defined to the person who makes these pathological proclamations.
So you say, I'm struggling because I'm on the front of Pirsig's train. And then they say, what does that mean? What if the response is something to the extent of, I'm engaging with dangerous, taxing, new material that's at the forefront of my understanding?
But that's a description, not a definition. Maybe it can be reformatted. Pirsig himself says the train is knowledge. Pirsig's train is knowledge. What he's talking about is acknowledging the necessary function by which that knowledge grows, because it can't be possible for knowledge to be static. So then, to be on the front of Pirsig's train is to engage in the insert adjectives process by which knowledge expands. You have to be careful with that, because the problem with Pirsig's train, even in Pirsig's definition, is that knowledge is assumed to be static. There seems to be this recurring theme of verbs that are masquerading as nouns. So Pirsig's train perhaps would be better defined as dynamic knowledge. And being on the front of Pirsig's train is to be engaged in the dangerous, taxing, and new process by which dynamic knowledge grows.
So the new part of that is supposed to be the fact that what you're interacting with is new material. So that's kind of in the word grows, but I don't know if engaging with new material that's at the forefront of your understanding needs to be built into this.
If we strike it from the definition, does it still function?
The dangerous taxing process by which dynamic knowledge grows? Can you defend dangerous?
What an excellent segue. Because if we said yes, then my immediate follow-up would be to predict the retort of the generic third-party individual who will claim, why is it dangerous?
Is that a question that you're posing?
That is a question I am predicting. I am predicting that the generic third-party individual will retort with that question. And if we were going to commit to this formulation, we also need to establish what the response to that question
Well, that's what I'm bringing up. When I say, can you defend the word dangerous, I'm actually posing that to you.
At this current juncture, no. I do not have the ability to defend danger, which is why we're here. What is needed in order to defend it?
You would have to look at the circumstances that you're trying to apply this to. When someone tells you that you're under the tree, for example, are they doing so in the context of a certain set of actions that they're criticizing?
No, they're not criticizing actions. They're criticizing propositions that are counter to theirs. It's a function of browbeating for disagreement. The accuser makes a proposition about X. So to use formal logic terms, my accuser proposes P. I propose not P. And the fact that I propose not P, the response is, you are a philosopher under the tree. Because usually the way this plays out is that my accuser makes a proposition. And then I make a counter proposition that says, this option is inferior to this other alternative that I am specifying. So this ad hominem of a philosopher under a tree functions as a tool to dismiss the alternative that I am presenting. Your alternative is actually worthless because this alternative is the product of a philosopher sitting under a tree, and therefore the alternative is useless. It's not actionable. It's idealistic. This is another term that comes up in this form of ad hominem. It's academic. It's not usable. Your alternative doesn't work.
Are you indicating that the alternative that you're presenting is actually tangible? And that that's not a legitimate criticism in terms of the hypothetical?
Yes.
And that you have a tangible alternative that you're presenting, and that someone is calling that alternative intangible but not providing the tangible explanation as to why.
Correct.
And subsequently making a fool of themselves.
Yes. That is definitely an example where the retort of being on the front of Pirsig's train occurs. Another example is in those instances where you are speaking imprecisely, where your speech is imprecise. You are not able to articulate clearly what it is that you're trying to point at. So there are two categories. We have the ad hominem category, and we have the other category that proclaims, just spit it out. Speak in plain English. What's the bottom line? And this is another example in which the statement, I'm on the front of Pirsig's train, is an actual legitimate explanation for your difficulties. So there are two examples in which the term being on the front of Pirsig's train would occur. One is a retort to ad hominem. The other is an explanation for imprecise speech.
Okay. The ad hominem problem is contradictory from the outset because ad hominem doesn't allow for legitimate responses. If you're using the logos to respond to ad hominem, then you're basically just saying a truth into the void of ad hominem to try and get something productive to happen. That doesn't mean that the person who's using the ad hominem is going to listen to a word that you have to say anyways. The idea that ad hominem can be responded to in terms of the thumb up sense of what ad hominem is, thumb up, there's no responding to ad hominem. You need to pivot at that point. So if you want to say that the response to ad hominem when someone is saying that you're under the tree because you think that you can just sit in your safe, comfortable, static environment and come up with all these theories that don't actually apply to anything in reality, and you want to say, no, this is not safe, actually, and it's not comfortable, it's very taxing, and I'm encountering new material, which is not static. I'm pushing the forefront of my understanding in the sense that you are engaging in the process by which dynamic knowledge grows, and that this position on the front of the train with a sense of nobility is not just more rooted in reality, but it is the way to be rooted in reality. What the train is trying to do as an alternative to the ad hominem is saying that these accusations are the opposite of what's actually happening. And it's just trading a metaphor for another metaphor. So to say it's not a tree, it's a train, is just a way to acknowledge a more accurate form of the circumstances at hand. But I don't know how much you're really going to be able to expect the person who's laying ad hominem on you to follow that or even care.
But all that means is that we just have one less thumb down example to worry about. We still have the other example over here about the person proclaiming to speak in plain English.
That's fine.
We're not off the hook for coming up with a decisive, succinct definition.
That might all just be to say that that definition would apply to the response to ad hominem, but just how much it gets defined, you probably aren't going to expect it to really go anywhere as a response. So that doesn't mean that the definition isn't intact. We can put the ad hominem response aside, if you don't mind, and focus on the accusation of speak in plain English or go faster.
Speak in plain English. Just say the bottom line. And this is a situation that assumes that the speaker, meaning the person who is on Pirsig's train, is in a situation where they're having to speak barb through material that they have yet to pull firmly into defined, articulated knowledge.
Well, the reason why you're hesitating to respond to that is because it's dangerous what you're responding with. It's important because you have to live with the consequences of that response. You need it to be accurate. That's where the danger lies. That's what's causing the hesitation. And you're also in a hostile environment because someone that was barbing with you on this material wouldn't make these demands of you, but would be trying to access the best thing to respond to in order to actually understand the meta of what's happening. So that's not the situation. So you're not in a barbing situation. You're in a, we'll just call it a hostile environment by comparison. And someone is rushing you to make statements that you are going to need to accept the consequences of. You're trying to expand and grow your dynamic knowledge so that you can respond with the best possible option. But this person's not actually helping you to do that. They're actually making things worse by criticizing you for being on the front of the train that's not going fast enough. as if you can do anything other than be on the front of the train. So perhaps in terms of a definition, being on the front of Pirsig's train is a condition that's the result of a process. You're optimizing the growth of your dynamic knowledge. So the condition that occurs as a consequence of optimizing that growth.
So being on the front of Pirsig's train is a condition resulting from optimizing the growth of dynamic knowledge.
It's not plain English, but I don't know if it's better to respond with something indirect to that kind of situation, or if it needs to be simplified in the context that you're providing.
I'm looking at this right now, and it strikes me that each one of the elements in this definition can be unpacked. Just say the bottom line, speak in plain English. What's the problem? I'm having a hard time explaining X because I'm on the front of Pirsig's train right now. Pirsig's train? What is that? Pirsig's train is dynamic knowledge. What's dynamic knowledge? Well, it's just knowledge, but in order for knowledge to be actually knowledge, it has to be going somewhere. Knowledge is a verb masquerading as a noun. All right, but what does that have to do with a train? All right, well, if you understand that the train itself is dynamic knowledge, then being on the front of Pirsig's train is a condition resulting from optimizing the growth of dynamic knowledge. I am in the middle of optimizing the process by which knowledge grows. And as a consequence, my words are coming out garbled. Because the key verb optimizing is not past tense yet.
Mm-hmm.
As soon as it goes from optimizing to optimized, the words will be very clear and very organized and very easy to consume.
And consistent, if you want me to say it again.
Yeah. I kind of like that formulation. Being on the front of Pirsig's train is a condition resulting from optimizing the growth of dynamic knowledge.
It's a state of being that's the direct consequence of engaging in a very specific process. Where, for example, I am engaged in this process of trying to understand something new so that it's adequate and it's consistent and that it constitutes itself as knowledge. So that it is consistent so that I can repeat myself, so that it is reliable. And that leads you, especially when you're using the logos to carve a path forward, it leads you to the edge of something that you're not familiar with. A lot of times that's the logos cutting into the unknown, trying to extract some order from the void. And that's not a safe, comfortable thing to do. And it's not instantaneous. That knowledge isn't just gifted to you. It's work. Doing that work, that vital and important work, leads to an observable condition. That is, I'm trying as hard as I can to figure out what to say. But this material is so new that I'm hesitating. I don't have my footing. I'm not underneath this well enough to be able to stand solidly on top of it. So there's the process of growing that dynamic knowledge and the intensity of being on the front of the moving train. That is supposed to be acknowledged within the term as we use it, because this is not a relaxing condition at all. It's extremely stressful. Again, because I'm doing everything that I can to figure out what to say, or to figure out how to understand what's happening. I'm putting in the work to try and understand what's in front of me. So the condition that's a result of doing that work, it might look like I'm distressed in a way, but that doesn't mean I shouldn't be. Anyone that's barbing and anyone that's used to trying to get as close as they can to the logos is going to realize just how intense it is to be at the front edge of that moving expansion and growth of knowledge. Very difficult, very rewarding. A little bit of a problem when someone isn't able to recognize it as a consequence of doing proper work, because it would indicate that they're not in the practice of doing that proper work, which is why they're not able to recognize it when they see it. But that would indicate that your being in the condition of doing the proper work links you more to reality than your accuser, not less.
I like that. It's a closer link to reality.
It's consistent with the logos too.
Hmm.
Or even as Pirsig was talking about, where else is this information to be stored? How else is this supposed to happen?
So the definition that we have currently formulated, I think, holds sufficient. We have one more. But it is very necessary to acknowledge this. And this is actually one of my old terms. What comes out of barbing, as we're talking about two people using the logos in dialogue and then using Pirsig's knife in order to create the subdivisions, in order to create the alternatives and the options, and how this process of barbing oftentimes leads you to a situation where you're strapped to the front of Pirsig's train. All of this comes with a payoff. You're doing this for a reason. There is an undeniable reward for doing this work, connecting you closer to reality.
Defensively proper.
Defensively proper, exactly right. The reward from this barbing process is you get freestanding claims at the other end of this. And those freestanding claims, when properly constituted, are the equivalent of gold. That is how valuable they are. And so the last thing that we need to do is to articulate a definition of the term freestanding claims because of how valuable they are. Because of the fact that they are very properly compared to gold in their value.
The value of freestanding claims that result from the growth of dynamic knowledge?
Are you asking a question?
I'm asking if that's correct in what you're formulating.
Yes. What you walk away from the barbing process, if it's ideal, is you have freestanding claims.
Okay.
And so this is yet another problem when I try to explain to the third party about freestanding claims, like, you need a freestanding claim, or I need to help you reformat this into a freestanding claim, or this is not a freestanding claim, it doesn't make sense. The question is always levied at me, what's a freestanding claim? I don't understand what that means.
Great.
And the only thing that I'm left with to improvise is to tell them, freestanding claims are gold. But that's not comprehensible. It's the very thing you're after when you are barbing, when you're using the logos, when you're strapped to the front of Pirsig's train. That's what you're after. When I think back to the history of when I first began employing the term, I remember in the old days talking about freestanding claims as claims whose truth value could be independently affirmed or denied. As an example, what is a not freestanding claim? I said was, that's not actually what you believe, or you don't actually believe that, does not constitute a freestanding claim. It's a non-freestanding claim because the person whom you are levying this proclamation can easily say, yes, I do, or no, I don't, depending on whether the claim is a positive or a negative. And then that's the end. There's no follow-up. It seems to be that freestanding claim might be tied to the idea of axiom.
Let me ask you this. So we've derived 3 definitions today as a result of our dialogue.
Our barbing.
And pursuit of the logos. Well, I wasn't going to use the term in its definition, but as a result of this dialogue, we've looked at definitions for barbing, Pirsig's knife, and the front of Pirsig's train. Are those definitions freestanding claims?
Yes, these would be constituted as freestanding claims.
Okay, so this would be an example of valuable material that's generated from this kind of dialogue, which is exactly what you're trying to do, right? So we've basically done that with the material that we already have in front of us. Do you need a definition of what makes these definitions that we've derived valuable definitions? What is it that you're looking for exactly?
Consistent with all this, I am looking for a succinct definition that I can pluck out independently from the context of a book, the context of a conversation, the context of a thing. Basically, when you have a generic third-party individual who has no access to any of the references that you have, you can't assume that they've read Pirsig. You can't assume that they've listened to this podcast. You can't assume anything beyond what it is that comes out of your mouth to them. So when such a person says, I don't understand what a freestanding claim is.
Yes, you do.
Well, you can say, yes, you do, because I'm about to tell you. Freestanding claims are defined as X. Done.
Someone who says what's a freestanding claim is asking for a freestanding claim. They have to know what it is if they're going to ask you for it. So if you responded with a non-freestanding claim to the question of what's a freestanding claim, then they themselves would find that to be an absurd response.
Yes, comedic but not helpful.
So you want a definition that functions as a freestanding claim for the term that is a freestanding claim.
Yes.
Right. Independent verification is definitely part of it. Subject to scrutiny and cross-examination. So in that way, it's a claim that can be understood by a third party, no matter where you bring it.
Correct. And also has to be independent of context. That was another thing. You need to be able to make the same statement anywhere you take it. Because the idea of the freestanding claim was that you can say it word for word, regardless of context, and it always provides a binary. This is either true or false. If it's true, then A. If it's false, then B. It doesn't change depending on who you're saying it to.
Mm-hmm. Well, it doesn't require context in order to use the term. If anything, it applies to whatever context that you bring it to.
So how about this? A freestanding claim is a claim whose truth value can be affirmed or denied regardless of the context in which it is made. So that's the reason why claims like, you don't actually believe that, doesn't qualify. Because the ability to affirm or deny it changes depending on its context.
I might want to add, can be confirmed or denied by anyone, regardless of the context.
By anyone. Okay.
One of the things that you're encouraged to do with freestanding claims is to bring them elsewhere.
They must be portable. Yes, exactly.
Well, they need to be able to go to different people.
Mm-hmm.
They're already prepackaged in terms of their portability to be able to be presented immediately to someone else.
There are no requirements upon the participants.
Correct. It's already done.
Mm-hmm.
That work is already done. It can be confirmed or denied by anyone at that point.
So, just to reiterate, a freestanding claim is a claim whose truth value can be affirmed or denied by anyone, regardless of the context in which the claim is made. Let's see if we can feed that back into the idea of barbing. So, you have barbing. You're at the front of Pirsig's train, slashing away with Pirsig's knife, and what you're trying to harvest are freestanding claims. And then once you have those freestanding claims with their relevant truth values assigned to them, it becomes the rest of the train. It becomes not the edge of the train. It moves to the back. It becomes articulatable. And because it's articulatable, it is portable and it becomes independent of context. That independence of context is what makes it freestanding. And those freestanding claims are the substance of axioms, are the substance of principles. True or false, yada, yada, yada. If true, then A. If false, then B. You, the person to whom I am speaking, have to make a decision. And that's how you build out your world. That's how the universe is constructed. That is how human knowledge and human understanding expands. You're trying to get your hands on as much of these as possible. Freestanding claims. Doesn't matter who's listening in. It doesn't matter what the context is. It doesn't require anyone to pre-read or pre-listen to or pre-do anything. It's all there. The observer, the beholder, just has one decision to make, true or false.
And very conveniently, the consequences are already laid out for true and false.
Freestanding claims are the substance of positions. It's the substance of worldviews. It's the substance of the way a generic individual understands and interfaces and experiences with the world and reality. It's the substance of reality. And when you have two people who are in disagreement about something, who can't agree upon something, well, guess what? The freestanding claims is what provides the bridge. What is the freestanding claim that is in conflict here?
Right.
What is the freestanding claim that person A is affirming and person B is denying? Well, one of you is wrong.
I might refine that state of reality clause to the value of putting the work in to generate order. You get order out of that.
Yes.
Very useful, practical order. Not the order of the pathological nature, but the one that you need when you're in the situation of the chaos of fundamental disagreement. If you have a better grip on the meta.
And that's two people. It's even applicable to the individual. When the individual doesn't understand what the individual should do, how do I, the individual, proceed?
Mhm.
How do I get a grasp on this? You have a freestanding claim that you can affirm or deny.
At whatever level of meta.
Whatever level of meta. I mean, you have a platform by which you can query the input of others.
Mhm.
You have a common reference to compare. You have an ability to tie any observer to the same thing. And the more you pile these up, the stronger your bulwark against the chaos becomes.
Sure. And it's going to be very convenient when another individual provides the same affirmation or denial of a truth value as you. Because then you've found something that you can agree on.
Mm-hmm.
Finding something that you can agree on is pretty valuable. But figuring out the state of things in such a way where it's accurate enough to understand what it is that you're even talking about in the first place, much less whether you agree, is not an instantaneous process.
Clearly.
But it's incredibly valuable because it generates the means for cooperation at all, or for growth. And it does apply to the individual, and just like we were referring to two individuals that are oriented toward the logos, that are having dialogue with each other to help each other understand how to get as close as possible to the logos, an individual is capable of generating freestanding claims. Maybe it comes out of dialogue. But once that individual has for themselves those freestanding claims that are organized into their little boxcars in the train, other people can have freestanding claims too. And these freestanding claims that are pitted against each other, there's some really good and productive work to be done with that as well. Because these freestanding claims might be the best that you know now, but those can be improved upon for yourself, and others can be improved upon too. That doesn't mean that you concede to others' freestanding claims unless they're actually better, but every individual ought to be able to assess the best option so long as they're engaged with the question of what's the best option. They should know for themselves.
Well, that's all from me. Anything you want to finish off with?
I think that the best way to close this off would be to read the definitions of the 4 freestanding claims that we've generated as a result of this process. Invite anyone in the audience to go test them. See if they withstand scrutiny and cross-examination. Hint, if someone calls you a name in response to your trying to test freestanding claims, then that's something that you can raise an eyebrow at because they're probably not very interested in helping you understand the best way to move forward. And then that will also function as a brief bookend summary.
All right.
You can close out. Does that work for you?
Works for me.
All right.
So, today we talked about barbing, which is a situation in which two people are actively using the logos together in dialogue. We talked about Pirsig's knife, which is a method of decisive subdivision that provides more than one option of analysis. We've talked about Pirsig's train, which is a metaphor for dynamic knowledge, and being on the front of Pirsig's train, which is a condition resulting from optimizing the growth of dynamic knowledge. And then finally, we talked about freestanding claims, which are claims whose truth value can be affirmed or denied by anyone, regardless of the context in which it's made. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been the Garot Podcast. And until next time, Vita Rigo Spirante. Keep breathing, everyone.